Hey, what is up guys, this is Eli, and first of all I would like to thank you guys for 10,000 subscribers. That's a lot of people. It even amazes me that I could even get close to this number with such few videos I make and the long periods in between them, so that makes it extra special to me. So as a thank you for you guys I made this animation, and as you may have figured by now, I will also be teaching you guys how to make this in this video. So let's get started. We are going to start off with the top part of the chest. So let's begin with a cube object, and we're going to make this just a little wider and also a little less tall. Also, I would recommend just using these numbers I'm entering right now, because there are some parts which are very dependent on these numbers, so just stick with it for now. Also, we are going to add two segments on the y-axis. If you can't see them, you can go up to display and set it to garage shading lines. I'm also going to delete this Phong tag right now, so this low poly. The Phong tag is meant for smoothing. Okay, so let's make this object editable and go in the edge mode, so I can use the loop selection tool to select this middle ring. You can do that by pressing U and L. And with this selected, I'm going to scale this down while holding shift, so we can scale it down like 90%, but only on the Z-axis, so that is the blue handle for this one. And I'm also going to raise this up just a little, maybe also with the shift button, so 10 centimeters up. And then I'm going to select the top ring of edges and scale this down as well on the Z-axis, but maybe this time something like 50%. So you can see this is kind of the base shape of the top part. Let's go ahead and select these two sides with both polygons. And I'm going to use the inner extrude tool with preserve group still turned on. And I'm going to set the offset to 20 centimeters. This 20 centimeters will be used for all the offsets we will be doing for any cuts, so just remember to keep that number if you were using something else than 20. Okay, so now for the front and back portion we will be using something else than the inner extrude tool. We will just be using the loop cut tool. If you're on an older version of Cinema 4D, you will have to use the knife tool and set the mode to loop or path or something. So what I'm going to do is just hover above here and click somewhere close to the edge, and you will see it will give you the distance you've been clicking on. But I'm going to override this with a new number, which will be 20 in my case. So do the same thing on the other side. And you may notice that the distance will be something very large or nowhere near 20 centimeters. So in that case you just need to undo it and just try it on another edge. So in this case it will not work on the middle one but on the top one. Mostly it's the mirrored version of the other side. And I'm also going to add one more cut at the middle, so that is 50%. And I'm also going to make one cut at every side, so that is 10 centimeters. So that way I can fake this 20 centimeters gap in the middle. And now we can use the loop selection tool again to select this middle ring of edges. We don't need these anymore. And just press M and N on the keyboard to dissolve these. So that means they will be gone. If that doesn't work for you, you can also right click and select dissolve. Okay, so now we have these sides here and you can see the corners are having a diagonal line. But I would like to have something that is more squarish. So we need two more cuts actually. What I'm going to do is going in the right view. And I'm going to use the knife tool or the line cut tool in the newer versions. And we will be deselecting visible only, so we can cut through the whole object. So let's start here at this point. And I'm going to hold shift while moving to the side and then click to confirm this cut. And I'm also going to do the same thing towards the bottom. And also repeat these steps on the other side. Now we can also select these diagonal lines because we don't need them anymore. So select those. And we will be dissolving these again by pressing M and N. Okay, let's select these polygons at the bottom and delete them. We don't need these anymore. And also a good thing to do whenever you're deleting polygons or stuff is going in the point mode, and you will see there are a lot of floating points. So it is better to clean these up. You can do that by pressing Ctrl or Command and A to select all the points, and then press U and O to optimize, or right click and choose optimize. I'm also going to select these 4 points at the bottom, so the middle ones actually. And I'm going to scale these up a little on the Z-axis again, so the blue handle. So it lines up just a little more with the edges above it. Okay, what I'm going to do now is going in the polygon mode. And we're going to select all the polygons again by pressing Ctrl or Command and A. And what you would normally expect to do to give this a little more thickness is using the extrude tool. But you can see this is giving weird overlaps because all the edges are not exactly lined up with each other. We are working with angles, so that doesn't work for this. So what we need to do is making sure the create gaps option is still turned on. And I'm going to make an extrusion with an offset of 0 centimeters, which means that we have the same polygons at the exact same position. Now after this, we're going to scale these down. So let's go in the side view maybe and start scaling down. And I will stop when it is kind of lining up with the other edges. So that is 20 centimeters smaller. And I'm also going to move this down so the bottom edges line up with the other part. Okay, so this way you can see we don't have this glitchy stuff and overlapping parts. Let's go ahead and select all these large polygons which are left. And for this one we are also going to use the extrude tool, but this time make sure you deselect create caps, so we can make it sink in a little. Let's enter a manual number again, so everything will be the same way on the whole chest, so let's go for 5 centimeters. And also an optional thing to do is going in the inside of the chest and just selecting these polygons. And also doing the same thing by extruding it inwards 5 centimeters. So now we have new geometry to work with, so I'm going to select all these small edges at every corner. And after that we can use the bevel tool. I'm going to make sure it is set on 0 subdivisions to keep things simple, and it also looks nicer. And I will be using an offset of 15 centimeters. You can also select the limit option to keep it cleaner, so it isn't overlapping each other. You can also notice I have new lines on my model, which may not show up on your screen. And it is because these are n-gons, and I have selected this in the filter menu. So down here you have n-gon lines. And these are just calculated lines from Cinema 4D, where you don't have polygons which have 4 sides, so it tries to compensate for that. On flat surfaces you won't notice much of it, but if you were trying to model this and export it as a game asset or something, you should really try to get rid of these n-gons. So I'm going to clean it up just a little here. So at the front here I would like to get rid of this cross at the center. So what I can do is selecting the line cut tool again. And I will be selecting the visible only option this time, so I'm not cutting through the whole object. And I will just make a cut from this point to the other. Maybe also at the center and the bottom. So that way we can dissolve these edges at the center, we don't need these anymore. And you can see the new n-gons are starting to happen, which are kind of a hint where you should make a cut if you want to. And I'm also going to make some cuts towards the bottom. But for this it is better to deselect the visible only option again, so we can cut through the whole object. And when going in the front view to make these cuts, you can see it is kind of confusing where the edges are exactly. So we can see through all the edges on the whole object. So what you can do is go into display and select hidden lines. That way you only have the lines which are in front. So let's make a cut straight down again. And now we can dissolve even more of these diagonal lines. And I'm also going to scale these 2 outer edges just a little. Now let's select these polygons at the bottom we just created by making these cuts. And I'm going to extrude these downwards, maybe something like 20 centimeters again to stay in the exact same proportions. And I'm also going to scale down these 2 outer edges just a little, so we get a more interesting shape. Okay, I'm also going to disable the n-gon lines filter, so it is a little easier to see where the edges are. Okay, so what I would like to do now is adding some smoothing on the edges, which we can do by selecting them manually. You can also try to double click on these edges so it selects the ring of them. It works on some parts and it doesn't on some other. But I'm just going to limit myself to these outer lines, so not the ones connected with the deeper parts of the chest. So something like this. And then we can go to the bevel tool again and set the offset to something like 1 centimeter maybe. And also we are going to increase the subdivisions to something like 3 or maybe 5. Also one more detail you should notice, is here at the bottom, is that the beveling at these corners is looking kind of strange. So what we can do is going down here in the topology options, and you have this mirroring option. It is set to default, but if you set it to something different, you can see it totally changes how it will bevel the corner. So in this case, I think uniform looks the best actually. Okay, so that is the base shape of the top part of the chest. Let's continue by adding some details to this. First of all, I would like to cut out a piece at the front here, which will be the keyhole. So let's create a cylinder and roughly size it to something that could be a keyhole. And I'm also going to decrease the rotation segments of the cylinder to 8 segments. This way it will fit more with the low poly look, and it will also be easier to model with this. So let's just roughly scale this. And it also helps when we make this object editable. So we can select these 2 bottom polygons and just extrude these downwards. But you will not use the extrude tool for this, but just the move tool while holding Ctrl or Command and moving these polygons down. We are doing this because this way you just move the polygons down on the axis we are moving it on, instead of when you were using the extrude tool, it would try to extrude these polygons on the axis of the polygon, so it would turn wider towards the bottom. Let's also scale these down just a little on the x-axis, so that is the red axis. And now let's just randomly sync this inside of it. And we're going to create a bool object and drag both of them inside of it. And also make sure the cylinder is below the cube object in the hierarchy. And that way we get this intersection so it cuts out the shape in the chest. Let's add some more details. We're going to create a sphere object. And I'm going to make this editable and go in the side view. And in the point mode you can use the rectangle selection tool to select the whole left side or right side, it doesn't really matter. And just delete these points. And what I'm going to do now is just selecting this object again and scaling this down on one axis so it gets a lot flatter. Let's move this down so we can place this on the frame pieces of the chest. And I'm just going to stick with 2 pieces at every side. And it is also a good idea to keep it at the same distance from the edges, so I will just move them towards the edges and then use the move tool while holding shift to move them something like 10 centimeters maybe. You can also duplicate these and rotate them. Also, if you want to duplicate all of this to the other side, so mirror it, it is easy to do by just selecting them all and make a duplicate of them, so you can rotate them. But if you would try to move them, you can see the axis is slightly angled. So what we can do to move this exactly horizontally is selecting this button at the top. And that way the axis is reset to the world axis. And then just move these in position again. So now we have all these spheres on this. You can see these are just a bit too large. So what we want to do is scaling these down. So let's select all of them. But before we start scaling these down, we need to go in the Object Axis tab. And make sure you select Per Object Manipulation. This way it will scale down every object on its own instead of the whole group of objects. Let's group these together and give it a name. It also looks like I forgot to add some bevels on these edges at the keyhole piece. So I'm just going to do this right now. It will not be perfectly smooth in the corners because we already added the bevel on the other parts. But just try to select these edges like this. But luckily, because we set the metering to uniform on the previous bevels, it will not look too bad when we add these new bevels separately. Okay, let's continue. So what I will be doing now is adding some cube objects which are very thin. And I'm going to position these exactly on these deeper parts of the chest. So these will actually be there to add the materials on later, because it will look a lot better. So for this you can make it something like 2 centimeters thick. And I'm also going to add a fillet to this, so we have some rounding on the ends. So now we can add a duplicate of this and position it above the other one. And you can also try to line this up with this line you can see right here, so that is the line of the deeper part of the chest. And you can also scale this up on the y-axis. So now when these 2 ends connect with each other, you have some kind of smooth gaps in between them, which will cast some shadows when we continue with the lighting. So that's a good thing. So let's continue with the other parts. Maybe for this top part we will be using 2 pieces or just 1, that's up to you. And it is the same thing on the other side again, so you can copy and paste these and just rotate them. And we will also do the same thing on these sides. For the top cube at the sides, you will also notice it will always be too big. So for this one you will need to make this editable and just move these top points towards the center. So that is all there is to the top part. Now we can go ahead and select all these parts we just created and group them together, so it is a little cleaner. And now let's continue with the bottom part. For this one we will be using a slightly different technique because the shape is totally different. So let's create a plane object this time instead of a cube object. And we're going to rotate this so it looks like this. And we will also be decreasing these segments to just 1 segment on every axis. Let's make this plane editable as well. And also down here at the coordinates field you can scale this with exact numbers. So for this one I will be using 100 centimeters on the x-axis and also 180 centimeters on the z-axis if you rotated the object this way, so you need to make sure it looks something like this in the viewport. Let's move this down so it kind of lines up with the bottom of the top part. And we're going to select this bottom edge and use the scale tool to scale this out, so it roughly follows the lines of the top part. And maybe we also want to scale up this top edge just a little. So this looks like a shape that will fit. Let's hide the top part. And we're going in the polygon mode, so we can select this one polygon we have. And normally you would use the inner extrude tool again, but you will have these diagonal lines again at the corners, which we don't want. So this time I'm just going to manually add loop cuts at every side, so 20 centimeters again. But if you would try to make some vertical cuts on this, you will see the line is in a different angle depending on where you want to make the cut. So we don't want that because that's not exactly precise. Instead, we're going to set the offset mode of the loop cut option to edge distance instead of proportional. This way it will always stay at the same angle depending on the edge you are starting from. And for the horizontal ones we can also reset the offset mode to proportional just to be sure. And just make 2 more cuts at 20 centimeters. Let's delete this center polygon, we don't need this anymore. And we're going to select all the other polygons again. And use the extrude tool with create caps turned on. And extrude this something like minus 20 centimeters or just 20 centimeters, it doesn't really matter. This way we have this one piece of the frame. So let's line this up with the side while holding shift, so it moves in increments of 10 centimeters. And we're going to duplicate this to the other side while holding shift and command, so we have the exact mirrored version of this. And now what we would like to do is making a connection between these two objects, but these are two separate objects. So what we need to do first is selecting both of them, right clicking on them, and then go down here to connect objects and delete. This way we have just one object with all the geometry inside of it. Let's go in the polygon mode again and select these 4 corner pieces at every side. And then right click and select bridge. This way, if we are still in the polygon mode, you have this option delete original polygons. We want this to be checked, so it will get rid of everything we don't need anymore after making the connections. And just start by dragging from one corner to the other, but just make sure you use the same corner of the polygon at every side. So not the top left and the bottom right, but always the top left and the other top left. So this way we have some nice connections. Also, one more thing before we continue is making a duplicate of this object and just hiding it, so we have a backup object with this geometry which is clean and just not touched at all. We will need this object in the next step, so make sure you actually do this. So let's continue by adding some smoothing to these edges. So what you can do is using the loop selection tool again in the edge mode and select all the rings at the center and also at the sides, so the outer rings and the inner rings. Make sure to check every side, so everything that needs to be selected is selected. And then we can use the bevel tool again. And the values should still be at the same as we did them on the previous bevel. So what we can do is just scrolling down and selecting new transform. And that way it will set the bevel exactly like we did it on the previous one. Let's reveal the top part again so we can see how this looks. Maybe we want to move the bottom part up a little so it looks better. Okay, so now we're at the part where we want this backup object we just made a duplicate of. So let's hide the beveled one and unhide the clean one. And I'm going to make just another copy of this just to be sure and use that one instead. And what I would like to do now is adding some bevels at the inner parts of the frame. So what you would normally do is selecting these edges and just using the bevel tool to make some bevels like so, like we did on the top part actually. But you will see it will give us some weird glitchy stuff at the inside of the frame, which we don't want of course. So instead we will need to do some manual modeling. What you can do is using the loop cut tool again, and we will make a loop cut at 20 centimeters from every side of the corner pieces, like this. So when that is done, you can go in the polygon mode and select just these polygons at the corner, so the outside frame of it, and just press U and I on the keyboard, which will invert the selection, and press delete to delete everything else. Now we need to finish up some of these pieces so it looks like the bevel I originally intended to make. So what we can do is going in the edge mode and using the bridge tool to bridge these edges so we fill in these corners with a nice diagonal line. Okay, so when that is done on every side, we can select all of these polygons again. Let's also unhide the beveled frame we made. And I'm going to make an extrusion on these polygons we have selected with the create caps option turned on, and let's use something like 3 centimeters. This way we have some nice corner pieces which are the feet of the chest actually. So now we can also add some smoothing to this. You can do this manually like we just did it on all the other parts, or you can use the bevel deformer if you're on a newer version of Cinema 4D and just drag it on the plane object. And also set the offset to 1 centimeters with 5 subdivisions like we did on the other ones. But you can see we have some smoothing at these center pieces which are not exactly meant to be beveled. So what we need to do for that is selecting the used angle option. You could play around with the angle threshold, but it should be fine at the default setting. So what we need to do now is just adding these cube objects like we did at the top. So just use the duplicates of that. And maybe you want to scale them down so it is looking a little better. And then just repeat the same steps over again and group everything together to keep it clean. Let's add some final details to these bottom pieces we just created. So let's add a cylinder object maybe. And we're going to add 2 of these at the sides. So maybe let's try to center these up with these polygons like so. Duplicate them to every side. And just try to make sure the angles are lined up so the cylinders aren't floating next to the object. Okay, one last piece we are going to create for the chest itself are the handles at the side. So let's start off with a cube object, and I'm going to make this something like 12 centimeters on every side, or maybe even smaller if you like to, and just make it roughly 1/3 of the size of the side. And we're going to make this editable, so we can select both the outer polygons. And we're going to extrude these with the same size as we set the cube object itself. So that was 12 centimeters. This way we have exact cubes at every side again. And now we can select these new polygons at the front and extrude these out again so they almost hit the chest. Now use the inner extrude tool to give a second larger polygon at the same position. And then use the extrude tool again to make the full connection towards the chest. So what I'm going to do now is soloing this piece in the viewport. And I'm going to select these 4 edges, so the ones at the outer corners and the inner corners. And then use the bevel tool again with 0 subdivisions. So we can get something like this. And now use the loop selection tool in the edge mode again. So we can select this top ring and the bottom ring. And also these rings at the connections with the chest. And we're also manually going to add these 4 edges at the outer corners. So now use the bevel tool again. And we're going to set it to 1 centimeters with 5 subdivisions again, like we did on the other smoothed parts. It would look nice if we added some kind of angle to this, so it isn't sticking out exactly straight like it is now. The easiest and most reliable way to do this is using a deformer. So let's get a shear deformer and drag it under the cube object. And you can see this yellow dot is pointing upwards. So we want to rotate the shear object so it is pointing away from the chest. And then click Fit to Parent to make it exactly the size of the handle we just created. And now you can play around with the strength of it. Also set the angle to 0 if you want it to be a straight angle and not curved. And also one more thing to make it look even better is using the within box mode, so that way it is only deforming the object within this purple box you can see on the viewport. And then just move the box just a bit away from the chest, so it doesn't include these connection pieces at the side. And that way it looks the best in my opinion. So let's duplicate this object to the other side and rotate it of course. And that way we can also drag this under the bottom group we already had. Okay, so let's continue with one more piece we need to model. which is the key which will enter the keyhole in the animation. So that is just a cylinder again. Try to make it the size of the keyhole in the front view. And we're also going to decrease the segments to 8 in this case again, so it fits in the hole. And we're going to make this roughly the length of a key. And then what we can do is making this editable and selecting these front polygons and extruding them out a little, so we can scale them down just a bit. That way we have some kind of grounding to the front. And then to get these small pieces at the bottom, we're going to make some loop cuts. You could make some manual loop cuts, so 2 at every part. Or you could even make 1 loop cut and increase the number of cuts under the loop cut options. So this way we have new polygons at the bottom, which we can extrude downwards again with the move tool, so while holding Command or Control. This way it will always go in an exact vertical direction instead of growing towards the bottom. Okay, so when that is done, we need the part at the back, of course, the handle of the key. So for that we can use the cylinder object again, and we will need to rotate this like so and make it roughly the size of something that would fit. And we're going to decrease the rotation segments again to 8. And we can also delete the polygons at both sides, so we just have this ring of polygons. And now scale these down on the Z-axis, so the blue handle. This way it will turn into an oval. And we're going to select all the polygons, so we can use the extrude tool with the create caps option turned on, and that way we can give it some thickness. Also, one more thing you can do if you want to is selecting these outer rings of edges and just give them a bit of a bevel to make it look a bit smoother. Let's group both objects together and name it key, so it is clean again. And we can also place this under the top group because it will move together with the top part when it rotates, when it opens the chest. Okay, so that is actually what there is to the chest. What I did for this animation is adding some text inside of it, so the 10,000 number. You can do this by going in the MoGraph menu and using the MoText object. And then just enter the settings you like for the font and stuff. And what I also did is adding some fillet caps to this. You can also see it will start to look a little more fat, so what we need to do is decreasing the font weight of it maybe. And also the horizontal spacing so it isn't intersecting with each other. And one more thing I forgot to do is adding some plates or cubes at the bottom of the chest. So we need to animate this top group. But if you try to rotate it right now, you can obviously see it isn't rotating like we want it to. So what we need to do is moving the axis of the rotation to a more correct spot. So with the top group selected, select this Enable Axis button. And we're going to move this somewhere near the back here at the bottom. You can see it is overlapping as a hinge or something, and that way it will look the best in my opinion. But feel free to put it anywhere you like it even more. There is some overlapping and stuff, but this is some kind of cartoony style, so it doesn't need to be that realistic with real hinges and stuff. I'm not going to pay attention to that. Okay, so before moving on, let's add some more scenery around this, so a floor and background. So first of all, we are going to create this floor object and try to line it up with the bottom of the feet of the chest. And we're also going to create a background object, of course. As you may have seen in other videos, you can create an infinite floor look by adding a compositing tag to the floor object and then selecting the compositing background option. I'm also going to open my project settings by pressing Ctrl or Command and D. And down here you have the default object color. And I'm going to set this to 80% gray to get this kind of clay render. So you can see the background and the floor are working. It also looks like I need some small adjustments to these cubes. Also for this one I'm going to use an HDR image to light the scene, but for animations I have to tell you it is a little slower to render, so if you want something that will render your animation quickly, I would recommend staying away from this method and just checking my previous video on some lighting tips where you have some alternatives which render way quicker. But for this one you can go to the material manager at the bottom and click on create and load material preset, and in here you have a lot of presets on materials. but also lighting setup. So I'm going with the sunny neighborhood. So let's go in the render settings again, and I will be adding a global illumination, and you can keep the settings at default for now, just to see how it looks. Also, I'm not exactly sure if I already mentioned that you should add an ambient occlusion to make it look better, but if you haven't already, also make sure to add that one. So for my liking, the front of this chest is just a little too dark. So what I'm going to do is adding a light to this scene. And just add an area shadow to this. But maybe we can also decrease the intensity so it isn't too dominating or too bright. And you can see it is kind of positioned in front and above the chest, so that way it is compensating enough, I guess. And that way we have this more bright look to it. So here at the bottom, at least at my screen, I can see the keyhole, its surface is not exactly very smooth, so we have this line here, the edges which are showing. That is because we deleted the Phong tag on this, so maybe we should add the Phong tag back to it. The easiest way to do this is just duplicating it from another object in your hierarchy. So let's move on to some materials to make it look better. The first one will be for the background, so I'm going to use something like a very dark gray with a hint of blue in it. And I'm going to drag this on both the floor object and the background object. Also, one more thing, if you would render this, you would see the sky in the background, so we need to disable that the sky is seen through the background. To do this, we need to add a compositing tag to this one again. And you can uncheck Scene by Camera. Let's create a new material again. And this one will be for the golden frame, so we need a gold color, of course. And I'm also going to add a layer texture to this. So add a layer, and we can go inside of this by clicking the thumbnail. And then here we can start adding the layers. So the first one will be a shader, and go to surfaces, and we're going to add some rust to this. You can see the colors are very strange, but you shouldn't worry about that, because we are going to add yet another shader, which will be the color. And this one can be some kind of gold, but it doesn't need to be exactly the same color as the gold we just added. Okay, so when that is done, we need the rust beneath it to show through the color. So let's set the mode of the color to color. That way you can see through it, but this is still very patchy and way too dark. So we are going to set the mix strength of this layer to add, and also decrease the mix strength of it to something like 15%. Okay, let's go to the reflectance. Let's make this just a little wider, and also increase the specular strength of this to 100% so it is shinier. Maybe you can also right click on this sphere at the top, so you can change this to rounded cube to have a better understanding of how it looks on the object. So now you can see we have this reflection of the specular, which is very white, but we want it to be more gold looking. So at the bottom here, we can change the specular color to something more yellow. So not exactly gold, but more bright yellow. And this way you get this kind of fast rendering golden shiny look. We're also going to add a bump to this, and we're going to just manually recreate that same rust pattern. So create a layer. We're going to add a shader, and maybe we can also add a metal texture to this first to get it more layered. And after that we are going to add this rust effect we just added on the color channel. And now just set the mix mode to overlay for the rust layer. That way we have a mixture of both of them. Also, if we go back to the bump options, you can increase the strength of it to make it more defined. And that is all we need to do for the golden material. So let's add that to the frames. And maybe you can see some kind of weird projection on this. So the easiest way to fix this is just clicking on these materials and setting the projection from UVW mapping to cubic, and that way it is just projecting it like it should be. Okay, so let's move on to a new material again. But for this one we can actually just copy and paste this previous gold material, and we will be adjusting this. And this one will be for the other metal parts. So just change the color to something more gray. And we will also go in the layers, of course, because we have this yellow color inside of it. And we will set this to something more bluish, dark gray. Also, one last thing we need to adjust is the reflectance color. So let's also set this to our very bright blue color. Let's add this material to the feet at the bottom, the handles and the key. So moving on to the next material, which will be the wooden parts. What we are going to do is just ignoring the color of it, and we're just going to add a texture to this. Feel free to use any texture you find on the internet if you want to, but I will be using the wooden material which is built inside of Cinema 4D. So add texture and go to surfaces again, and we will select wood. Let's open this up. And the first thing I'm going to do is moving this point at the start of the gradient more towards the back, so the lines are more sharp. And I'm also going to change these colors. You can copy what you see on my screen or you can do something yourself, but I want it to be some kind of brown, which is very close to red or orange. And the second one will be just slightly different. It is just a few percentages different from the other color. Now down here you can play around with the values, but what I found to be nice looking is disabling all the grain on this. And we will also decrease the wave scale of everything, so something like 10% will do. And now we can drag this on these cubes we just created. I'm quickly going to disable the ambient occlusion and global illumination to have a faster render, so you can see how the texture is projected on the cube. This way you can see we have something that looks like wood, but maybe this isn't exactly realistic. I want it to be more stretched over the object and not as circular. So what we can do is going to this object and selecting the material, and we are going to set this projection to cubic again. And now we are going to manually adjust how this material is projected on this cube. So click on this button right here for the texture mode. And you should be able to see this kind of weird cage around the cube. So that is the cubic projection. And if you try to move this or scale this, you can see we have some kind of weird stuff going on. And that is because to actually do this correctly, we need to enable the axis mode. Don't ask me why, but it is just the way it is. So with that enabled, we can stretch this horizontally and maybe scale this down on its own as well. And that way we can get this stretched look on the texture. So to make things a little faster, I think it is easier to just copy and paste this material on all the other cubes instead of repeating these steps over and over again. And you can also add some variation to how it looks by moving the texture with this texture mode still enabled. So I'm going to speed this up for you guys. It is just the same steps and just try to move some of these textures so it breaks up a little more. Okay, so that is done. I'm going to re-enable my ambient occlusion and global illumination and see how this looks when we render again. And you can see this is how it looked in the example actually. So one more thing I'm going to do now is adding a camera object with a focal length of something like 50 to make it look more playful. And let's get one more render with everything opened up so we can see if everything is correct. And maybe you should be adding some of these wooden materials on the inside of the top part as well. Okay, so let's add some last preparations before we start the actual animation part. In the example at the beginning, you could see there are some lights. So these actually were some spotlights, so get one. And we're going to position this somewhere at the bottom of the chest. And let's go in the general tab of this light. And you can set this to any color you like. I got something in between pink and purple. And we're also going to change the type of spotlight to square spot. We are not going to add any shadows to this, but we will set the visible light to volumetric. This way the light will be more visible. So you can just use these yellow handles at the top to make it smaller. And you can also click on the center one and drag it down to adjust some of the inner fall-offs and stuff. And we're going to make some duplicates on every side and rotate these a little, so it is going outwards. And let's take a look when we render this again. This is kind of underwhelming, they are very small, so we need some adjustments. I have to admit that I always forget what setting is giving us what effects, so I usually just play around with these settings until something is changing. But for this problem that they look so small, I think it is just that we need to make them look bigger, so just increase the size at the top. So that is looking slightly better, maybe increase the size even more. And also one last thing I'm going to do is actually placing them all together so they are starting from the center instead of next to each other. And that way it looks just a bit better in my opinion. Also, once again, if you don't want this chest to look black in the viewport, you should hide it in the render view by clicking this top dot at every light. Okay, so finally let's get started with the animation. So the first thing we are going to animate is the top part of the chest. So make sure it is actually closed. You can reset the value of the rotation to 0. And let's also get us some space in the time by adding some more frames to this at the back. So let's go to 110 frames maybe. This one will be quite easy, but I know if you open the F-curves, it is really overwhelming because everything is inside of there. So we would like to have this more simplified, and that is actually easier to do than you think. So for this top part of the chest, I know we just want to add some rotation to this. So that means we want to disable all the other options when we make a keyframe. So down here next to the keyframe buttons, we can actually disable everything except the rotation option. And now we can create a first keyframe. What I found to be nice looking is adding it somewhere close to the 35 or 36 frame. Click on keyframe. And we're going to stop the animation at 88 frames. So now in between those two keyframes, at frame 61 maybe, you can add the rotation to this and create a keyframe. So this way we have it open and close. But we want it to stop when it is opened, so not exactly just opening and instantly closing. So we need a second keyframe at the same value. So we want this to be at somewhere close to 71 for example. But you don't want to press keyframe because it will be somewhere in between those two keyframes we already had. So instead we actually need the same keyframe as the previous one. So click on that one and hold Ctrl or Command again while moving it, so we have a duplicate of this again. It is actually the same thing as the model stuff. Okay, so that is the base animation. But one more thing I would like to add to this animation to make it look more realistic is a slight bounce when it is closing. But I'm not going to do this by adding manual keyframes at every spot where it should open and close, but instead I'm going to use the F-curves to do this for us. So to get this bounce I want some extra keyframe somewhere around frame 81 where it is totally closed. And then almost to the end of the animation I want one more keyframe where it is slightly opening, something like even just 2 degrees or something of rotation. Okay, so now you can see we have this base animation of the opening and closing with this slight bounce of it. But you can see it is still a little stiff, so we need to adjust the velocity of everything. Let's go to Window and Timeline, F-curve. Now you can open up this hierarchy at the side, and we only need to adjust the P-rotation for this one. And you can see this is the curve we have for the animation. It's an automatic smoothing on this, but we want to adjust this so it is more dynamic. So let's start with this one at the bottom. We're going to click on it and we're going to use this handle to stretch this. So to understand how this affects the animation, you could say that if it is going horizontally, it is going slower, and how steeper the line is, how faster it will go. So in this case it will start pretty slow and speed up, and then be slower and slower towards the middle of the animation. So let's do the same thing on the other side. So that is looking pretty good on this part already. So now we need to adjust the part at the back. And what we can do is rotating these handles a little, so it actually is giving us an extra curve at the top and also at the bottom. And one last thing to get a last bounce is using the last point and moving that handle downwards, so we have one more extra curve to the bottom. And this way you can see we have this bouncy look, but you can play around with the handles until it looks just fine with the timing and stuff. Okay, so next up we need to make this text come out of the chest when it is opening. So that is quite easy to do. We are going to add the first keyframe where it is just showing up like it should be in the chest, so that is in the middle of the animation. And then move back on the timeline until it is closed again. And we can move this text down to the bottom and also rotate this. But now I made a beginner mistake, and that is that only the rotation keyframing turned on, and I actually tried to animate the movement of it as well. So let's move back to the previous frame and make sure the movement is also being keyframed, so pay attention to that because otherwise it will not work. When that is done we can open the timeline again. And let's go to the mode text. You can navigate through this timeline just like you would in the viewport for modeling, so just try that out. And what I'm going to do with this curve is making it go slow at the beginning, speed up, and then going very slow towards the end of the animation. Let's also do the same thing with the rotation. And that way you can see this is looking pretty neat. Okay, so now we need to do the same thing with these lights we created. Of course, first of all, we need to make them visible again, but you can also disable them by clicking these check marks. So that way we have color again. And for this it is just the same steps again. We're going to create some keyframes where the animation will actually end, and then create the start position and rotation of the lights. So you can see in this animation I made it go slightly different in timing compared to the other animations. I think that looks a little more playful. But also when the lights are enabled again by clicking on these X's this time, you should take a render when the chest is closed to make sure no light is leaking through the object, because we used some cube objects to fill up the parts at the bottom, and that way there could be some kind of gaps in between them. So make sure that is not happening, otherwise you need to move them closer to each other. Okay, one last thing we need to animate right now is this key at the front. This one is a little more complicated, so I hope it will be clear to you what I'm doing. So let's start by moving the key inside of the keyhole. And I'm also going to add a rotation to this, so it looks like it is opening the chest. And let's set a keyframe at something like frame 30. That is the end of the animation again. So let's move back in time to somewhere close to 20. And I'm going to rotate this back to the original position and keyframe. Maybe add one more keyframe in front of it where it is slightly outside of the keyhole. And move these two keyframes apart. And then at frame 0 I will be adding the start position of the key, so that is somewhere up here. And also rotate it downwards a little, so we have this nice curve where it will come from. So this is looking a little weird at the end of the animation. So for that we need to go to the F-curves again. Let's open this up. And you can see there is a lot of stuff going on this one. Let's go to just the position Y. And we're just going to stretch these handles just a little more, so it is going slower in the beginning and the ending. That is enough for this one. Let's open the position Z. So what we want to happen again is that it starts slower. You can also move these dots as well. Okay, I think that should be alright for this one. So let's go to the rotation of the key when it is inside of the keyhole, so that is just one frame at the end. For this one we are going to speed this up towards the end instead of slow it down, so we don't need to move this handle horizontally, but vertically. Okay, now lastly we need to go to the rotation of the P-axis. This is how the key is rotating while it's flying towards the chest. And I'm going to stretch this bottom handle towards the side, so it is keeping its rotation for a longer time when it is coming downwards. Okay, so that is looking good when it is coming towards the chest, but it is taking a long time to get in the correct position when it is in front of the chest, so actually I should increase the size of these handles at the top again. And this way you can see it is straightening itself when it is getting closer to the chest. So let's go back to our camera view and see what this looks like. So one last thing we need to do now for this animation of the key is making sure it closes the chest and gets out of the view, so we can make this a loopable animation. Luckily this is very easy to do. Just select all the keyframes on the key object, and we're going to make some duplicates of this to the side. And now with these still selected, right click on them and go to Edit and select Reverse Sequence. This way it is reversed in time, so that is quite easy to do. And now just move them to the correct position so it is closing where it should be. Okay, let's play this one more time to see if everything is going like it should be. And you can see we have one more problem at the top of the key here. So when the chest is opened and waiting, it is rotating ever so slightly. And that usually happens when you reverse sequences and stuff, because it is trying to smooth the keyframes at the end of the original animation and the beginning of the new part we just duplicated. So what we need to do is going in the F curve again and find this rotation curve, so that was rotation B. And you can see here at the middle we have some very strange curve. So we need to straighten this out. So let's select both of these. And instead of making these linear with the options at the top, what you would normally do, you're going to use the option at the very right of the menu. So if you click that, the handles of the keyframe will turn to a value of 0. That way it is also straightened out. Okay, now let's take a render when the chest is opened to get things wrapped up. And you can see we have some kind of bad stuff going on in the background and on the floor. It is kind of patchy. And also, if you render this like it was with these settings right now, with the global illumination, it will give you a lot of flickering. So right now on the screen you can see how it will look if you render it with the default options. And that is even when you try to get rid of the patches at the floor. So this will not work for an animation. But luckily there are some settings I found on the internet. So what you're going to do is open the render settings and go into global illumination and change the primary method to QMC and the second one to radiosity maps. And make sure you're still inside of the general tab. And at the samples, we are going to click on it and set it to custom sample count. You can set this to something lower like 24. And then we are going to the radiosity maps tab. And in here, we are going to decrease the map density to 50%. One last thing we need to do to make sure it is looking smooth and detailed is changing the renderer mode from standard to physical. And that way you can render an animation with global illumination. So now on the screen you can see the difference between the original render and the new one with the new settings. So that is all there is to this one. I hope you learned a lot of new stuff today. And also if you want to share your end results of what you've made or anything you've just made regardless of this video, you can find me on Instagram or Twitter and just tag me there in your posts so I can see what you've made. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for watching and I will see you in the next video.